Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. Today our guests are Robert Daly, director of the Wilson Center's Kissinger Institute on China and the United States, and Maria Repnikova, an assistant professor in global communication and director of the Center for Global Information Studies at Georgia State University. Maria will be joining the Wilson Center in the fall as a new fellow. So Maria, welcome to your first official Wilson Center business of your tenure. So we gathered together here on the day that is the 31st anniversary of Tiananmen Square. We're going to talk about China. But before we talk about China in 2020, I want to give each of you a chance to look back to Tiananmen Square and what are the thoughts that you're having on the occasion of this anniversary. Robert, let's begin with you and then we'll hear from Maria.
The year of the Tiananmen Square protests and then the massacre, I was in Taipei. And we had, of course, been watching this build up. But when the tanks actually came in on June 3rd, when the violence started, I went down to the Chiang Kai-Shek Memorial, which is at the center of the city of Taipei. And there were many thousands of young Taiwanese there. And what struck me, they were mostly students. You would have expected that this would be an occasion right away in which the folks in Taiwan would make a lot of propaganda about, the insidious Communist Party and see this shows their true colors. And that's not what was going on at all. It was students sitting in sympathy for fellow students across the street. And that was the only context on that day. And it was a memorial, there was singing, but it wasn't political. It was personal, and it was a student-to-student response on the part of the Taiwanese. And that has always stayed with me. That's my single strongest memory. I was not on the mainland, but Taiwan.
Maria.
Well, I wasn't old enough to see these events for myself, but what I'm thinking about the past 2 days is the ominous events taking place in the United States and the way in which Chinese state, including the media, are taking advantage of the chaos in the US, the protest movements, but also the threats of violence to propagate their own political system and essentially to diminish any discussion of the Tiananmen Square massacre.
Would it be fair to say that China seems to almost be reveling in the U.S. troubles? The statements from the foreign ministry have seemed to take almost a certain amount of joy in pointing out American hypocrisy or whatever other charges China is making. Is that a fair assessment? Are they enjoying this moment?
Well, I think enjoying is sort of presuming a certain amount of.
That's pejorative. Yes, absolutely.
But taking advantage of it, I think, is definitely that's definitely the case, because we've seen both the foreign ministry officials, but also Chinese state media and also cyber nationalists discussing the movement in so much detail. And a lot of it is aimed exactly at what you say, is the exposure of hypocrisy, in particular when it comes to Trump's statements on Hong Kong versus domestic protest movements, but also just the overall kind of picture, the depiction of chaos and inequality, injustice in America as something that delegitimizes the US stance in the world and delegitimizes its critique vis-a-vis China.
Is the US getting China off the hook in a sense, Robert?
Well, I think that it is helpful to China. That China is behaving in exactly the way that Maria just described, but of course they are. This is an old practiced behavior. Even before the opening to China and in the 40 years since, the Chinese propaganda ministries have always seized on incidents of American racism to point to American hypocrisy. And, of course, they're not entirely wrong in this, whatever other use they may make of it. I was at the American Embassy in Beijing as, in essence, a public relations officer during the Rodney King beating and then during the acquittal of the policeman and the LA riots. And we went through a cycle of this. Then, on a much more minor scale, there have been other incidents since with, police killings of unarmed blacks. But now it's at a crescendo, as Maria said, because it does help China get off the hook somewhat, at least with domestic Chinese audiences, that the United States leadership is also calling for the military to violently suppress peaceful demonstrators. So yes, it's propaganda. On the other hand, we'd be really shocked if they missed this particular move.
Today, the legislature in Hong Kong voted to pass this national anthem bill, or the Chinese anthem bill, that had been causing a lot of unrest and protests and controversy. It feels as if the timing is not accidental, that the passage could happen at a time where the U.S. is reeling from its own protests.
Well, I think the timing is not accidental also because the US has been struggling with managing the pandemic, and that also presents the opportunity for China to kind of take advantage and take a strong action on Hong Kong. The US is highly distracted, and in terms of the global role, global scope of US actions, it's also been very weak or almost silent on many issues. So it's been an opportunity long coming. It's not just this protest movement. I think it's been about 2 months now, or maybe even 3 months, that China has been taking advantage to build up its global image, but also to take a hard stance on the issue of Hong Kong that it's been dealing with for quite some time.
And Robert, that in the bigger picture, beyond the particular piece of legislation I just mentioned, why now? Why is China taking this harsher stance, as Maria just described it, at this moment?
Well, there is the distraction of the pandemic, but I think that even before the pandemic, it was quite clear. And it's clear not only because of what's been going on in Hong Kong, but if you studied the history of the Communist Party of China, you know what they're aiming at. It was clear that as soon as there was any kind of slowdown in the protests in Hong Kong, this was something that the Communist Party was not going to allow to happen again. This is at its heart, the people of Hong Kong objecting to Chinese governance on what is Chinese soil. And as the Communist Party and Xi Jinping understand their national security, and their interpretation of it seems usually overly broad outside of China, even paranoid, that in fact is a threat to national security that cannot be countenanced. So right now there's an opportunistic side to this. Yes, because of coronavirus and now the chaos in the United States. But I think that this was in the cards, back in 2019. And we now have this law that has been mooted before, banning any disrespect of the national anthem. I think we can expect in the coming year China to put through a law that they've attempted several times before, rewriting the educational curriculum of Hong Kong as well. And so this, I say, it's related to the coronavirus, but it was in the cards before that.
Well, what does this do for China moving forward? And even if you separated out COVID-19, which of course can't happen, that's part of the story as well. But this sort of aggressive China, this assertive China, it doesn't seem to be the welcoming handshake of the economic dynamo China that was trying to engage the world on so many levels. It seems to be the kind of activity that would give the rest of the world pause. Is that your interpretation?
Well, it is giving much of the rest of the world pause, but the rest of the world isn't the primary audience for these actions. China's new assertiveness, whether it's in Hong Kong or the South China Sea, Taiwan, or even on the Sino-Indian border, the claims that China is now aggressively advancing are long-standing. And so I think that the message sent to the rest of the world, but primarily to the Chinese people, is that China now is strong and is asserting not new claims, but long-standing claims. And the fact that those claims are long-standing, the length of time in which China has said that it was the rightful master of these areas and hasn't achieved that, has been an index of failure and humiliation in the past. And that failure and humiliation is now over, and China is moving boldly forward. This is the message for the Chinese people. If we think back to Tiananmen, after Tiananmen, foreign institutions, universities, especially corporations, fled China. Almost nobody stayed. And when this was presented to Deng Xiaoping as an index of failure, I believe it was within 2 years of Tiananmen, Deng said, they'll be back. And he was right. So they can take a reputational hit. I think that is factored in. China is confident, correctly or not, that its economic weight and its ability to leverage its wealth to get deference and to legitimize its actions will carry the day in the long term. My guess is that that is the thinking in Beijing.
Maria, lots of countries were taking advantage of the Belt and Road Initiative and the investment that brings along with it. Does this create a bump in the road for China, or is it full speed ahead after the pandemic ends?
Well, I think very few countries are daring to challenge China when it comes to losing any economic benefits of this relationship. So a good example of that is the recent crisis in Guangzhou with the African diaspora community there. African immigrants that were targeted and some of them expelled from their homes and treated very badly, but that crisis kind of ended up sparking up, but then quickly getting resolved by elites in Africa and Beijing, again settling for this collaborative framework of the relationship and maintaining their economic ties. So I think that despite the kind of the crises that, the tensions that are still there under the surface, whether it's with Africa or with Russia, with other nations, the economic benefits and the economic entanglement is so strong that most wouldn't speak out in the long term, or at least wouldn't challenge that relationship as strongly in the long term.
Sorry, excuse me. And I was the criticism of China as it relates to whether or not they were holding out on the WHO. I would like to get both of your thoughts on that. Maria, let's start with you on this one. Is the criticism fair? Do we have evidence that China withheld valuable information and didn't share it with the world in a timely manner?
Well, some of the evidence is coming out of recent reporting, the investigation by AP showing that WHO was pushing China to reveal information in a quicker fashion, but they, prevented that from happening. So there's definitely some evidence of the slower release of information. But at the same time, once some of that information was released, there's been a really strong collaboration between China and the WHO, and US withdrawing from the WHO creates even more space for China to lead the organization in the future.
Robert, there it is, more space based on US actions for China to fill the void.
And that is exactly right. This is an act of self-harm, and it's also harmful to the international system. Maria's depiction of the WHO relationship with China, I think, is accurate. There may well have been too much deference early on the part of the WHO to China, but the WHO, when it goes into China or the United States or any other country, cannot compel cooperation. So there's a built-in need for it to go along to get along. And early critiques of China for not providing information could just as well have resulted in a longer delay in the provision of that information and less cooperation afterwards. So I don't mean to excuse the WHO. There are legitimate questions about its behavior. But I think that those issues do pale in comparison to the United States pulling out of the WHO and rejection of international cooperation on the world's greatest common threat at the moment.
There's a question that, Maria, I've been asking Robert for probably a couple of years now on Wilson Center Now broadcasts, but also in private discussions. So I'm going to ask him again, but I want to start with you. Is this another Cold War? Is that the proper characterization of the relationship between China and the United States?
Well, I'm a little bit reluctant to use the Cold War term to depict this relationship just yet, because it is a really particular historic framework, and it also included or involved a lot of competition in other parts of the world, direct, overt competition, whereas now I think we don't see as much of that in the same aggressive fashion as we did during the first or the real Cold War. But I do think the relationship is deteriorating at a really fast pace, in particular when it comes to public opinion on both sides. I saw that recent public opinion surveys in the US show that Americans increasingly dislike China or have very negative views of China more than decades ago. And we see the same thing happening on the Chinese side, rising cyber nationalism, attacks on anybody who's pro-US on social media. So these signs are really worrying. From the elite level to the public level, there's a huge degree of deterioration, and these ties are going to be really difficult to heal no matter who becomes the next president.
Robert, we've been charting the evolution of your thinking on this question, and I don't want to force sort of a terminology that may not match up in a one-to-one manner, but how should we think about this relationship at this moment?
Well, I hesitate to say this because it could be seen as debunking the work of think tanks, but I'm not sure that my thought on this question matters very much anymore. I agree with Maria that we should be very hesitant to accept this notion of a new Cold War. There are a number of ways in which it's a misleading historical analogy, and then once that idea takes hold, it develops a momentum of its own and can push itself in directions that we need not and should not go, and eliminate or cloud our ability to perceive opportunities for cooperation. Most of the people in the expert community that I speak to, not all, but most, also reject this idea of a new Cold War. But we don't get to decide. The question is really whether this phrase catches hold in the popular imagination. If non-experts, whether they are in politics or the media or in other institutions, grab on this and it gathers a certain weight, then that is going to be the analogy and the operative phrase, regardless of what experts think. And I don't think our time will be best spent telling people why an analogy that has already been accepted is wrong. We're going to have to try to deal with the aftermath of that.
Or lead the discussion by coming up with an analogy that you think is more accurate.
But it's got to be sharp and it has to stick. And it has to refer to something that people already know or already think they know, which by definition means it's going to be inaccurate in a complex and unprecedented situation. So there is sort of, yes, a cottage industry to come up with some catchy new phrase. We've talked about everybody wanting to be Kennan, but no one's hit on it yet. And I think that, new Cold War has pulled up anchor and is getting ready to leave port here. And so unless there's another phrase soon, we're going to be stuck, I'm afraid, with that one, ill-advised though it is.
And I'm sorry if I've contributed to promoting that terminology, but let's ignore the terminology and what you call it. But Maria, something you said about a fast deteriorating relationship. So one of the aspects of the Cold War was that nations had to choose sides, right? You were either part of the Soviet sphere or you were part of the U.S. and the Western Allies sphere. Are nations of the world in that situation right now? Must they choose to pick sides between the US and China?
Well, I think many nations refuse to pick sides, and maybe they picked sides more overtly during the Cold War, but nowadays they explicitly refuse to do so. My research in the context of Africa and Ethiopia in particular, I found that leaders, intellectual leaders, politicians, students, nobody wants to pick a side of whether they're pro-US or with China. They want to take advantage of different partnerships. So for them, this idea that there's this enhanced competition that's mostly coming from the US, by the way, not from China. China is not advocating that line as much at all. It's responding to the US, including the terminology that Robert just mentioned, in the Cold War terminology, is a way to kind of also alienate China into this really aggressive, responsive kind of nature. So they're responding to it because they have to, but they're not promoting those terms themselves as much. And the elites in the context of Ethiopia and Africa, they don't really, want to buy into this paradigm that they have to choose sides. They resist it. They want to maintain their agency to take advantage of whatever US or China has to offer, or Europe or Saudi Arabia or whoever else is coming into their country for economic or political deals.
Robert, do the US or China want nations to choose sides?
Well, neither is saying that, of course, but that doesn't mean that we mind having nations more explicitly on our side. It is true that nations, including American and Chinese neighbors, do not wish to choose sides, but the issue is going to be forced in some cases when we have systemic decoupling. Increasingly, the United States in its way, meaning sort of declarative, bellicose, loud, accusatory, but also China in its way, couched in more traditional diplomacy, are finding that the interoperability of the kinds of systems the United States prefers and those that China prefers is fading. There's a growing sense that we simply can't work with these guys on their terms. And it's when systems come apart that there is going to be a form of choosing forced upon other countries. And you've mentioned the WHO. That's a great example. We've pulled out or threatened to pull out. I'm not sure that that's technically happened yet. And President Trump has said that this money will go to various unnamed worthies. Well, now other countries have a choice of joining a WHO that will be increasingly funded by and tilted toward China, or no WHO at all. Will America see them staying with the WHO as a tilt toward China? We are threatening increasingly sanctions on Chinese banks and individuals that are increasing China's interest in building its own separate international payment system to compete with SWIFT. If there are two systems of international payments, countries then are forced by the nature of the system to choose one or the other. So they don't want to, but decoupling and building separate infrastructures, separate systems is going to tend to force those decisions going forward.
I want to get a final thought from both of you now on an issue that has sort of hovered over this, or a country, which is Russia, right? We've made I've used the Cold War analogy, and both of you have deconstructed that in modern terms and said it has limited utility. And now we've talked about choosing sides and whether alliances spring up. What is Russia's role in this US-China debate? And speaking of creating opportunities for other players, is there an opportunity for Russia right now? And how might that play out? Who is in the position to best benefit from that?
Why don't we go to Maria first on that one?
Maria,
the first thing to mention is that Russia is also similar to China, taking advantage of the chaotic events in the United States, both in terms of the pandemic management or mismanagement and the protest movements. And I've seen various statements by Russian officials essentially saying directly that US no longer has any legitimacy to criticize any country on human rights records. So they're making those statements. Russia Today, the main propaganda arm of the Russian government internationally, is constantly reporting on various inadequacies in governance in the US. And right now they're zooming into the protest movement. So they're really taking advantage of the chaos. I think even more so than the Chinese propaganda machine. They're more masterful at that. They're more aggressive, and they're more focused on destruction of the US and destruction of the Western system of governance, whether it's economic governance or political governance, and especially when it comes to US ideals and hegemony, as they put it. So they're actually much more intensively kind of pursuing that path of destruction than China. China is a recent actor in that sphere. They've been much more balanced in the past. So that's the first thing to say. But the second thing is that despite all this, unraveling, Russia and China's relationship is still pretty close, and especially economically, they're quite embedded with one another. The trade is still, persisting, and there's more and more exports of oil from Russia to China. And even though during the initial phases of the pandemic, there was a lot of suspicion of China, and the border, as you know, has been kind of a sensitive area, with some of the border regions have been closed because of the pandemic fears. There's still quite a lot of, positive economic ties between the two nations, and I think that's not going to go away. So the idea of kind of decoupling Russia and China from one another doesn't seem to be happening anytime soon.
Okay, thanks. Robert, by expertly directing the question to Maria, you now give yourself the final word.
Well, it'll be a short word. I agree with everything that Maria has said. The Chinese-Russian entente is limited, but I think it's durable, flexible, and to be taken seriously. At the same time, I'm reminded I was in Moscow about a year ago, and you see no sign of institutional or cultural affinity between Russia and China. It is evident precisely nowhere, except in the occasional tourist group. Whereas if you stop into a little 7-Eleven/bookstore on the Arbat, you see Rick and Morty posters and American books, and the institutional cultural points of reference are more Western, including not only American, but American as well. So I don't think that it's an absolute shift toward China in all things in the way that China would like that to be the case. Nevertheless, I think that the Entente is to be taken seriously, and increasingly seriously, because these countries don't want their choices shaped by the United States, and they make increasingly common cause.
Robert, you always remind us to not underestimate the power of popular culture or soft power in this equation. So maybe Rick and Morty will be the opening to change the world here. Thanks to both of you. Maria, it's great to have you now as part of the Wilson team. We'll figure out how that will work in the age of pandemic. Yes. And Robert, as always, love hearing your insights into the larger discussion. Thanks to both of you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I also want to thank those of you watching and listening to the video and podcast version of Wilson Center Now, and hope you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.